understand how people are changing the environment today and how it may change in the future, we need to understand how the environment has changed in the past. We can gather evidence for the past based on the chemistry of things like sediment layers, tree rings, cave deposits or speleothems, fish ear stones or otoliths, and bat guano, which accumulates in caves generally. One of the key questions concerning global change includes what is the Antarctic ozone hole and what is its significance. The Antarctic ozone hole is an area of extremely low ozone concentration in the ozone layer. This ozone is important because it protects us at the surface from receiving dangerous amounts of the sun's ultraviolet and other shortwave radiation. This is the type of radiation, ionizing radiation, that does damage to your cells, generating things like skin cancer, for instance. It was discovered here in Antarctica at Vernadsky Station. This is a Antarctic research station that was formerly owned by the British government, transferred to the Ukrainian government a while back, I think maybe in the, late 80s, early 90s. You can see some images here in the station. This is a bar that the Ukrainians have built out of a shipwreck where they proudly serve their homemade vodka. This was taken on Christmas Day about 10 years ago or so. And as typical of many of these stations, you can see remnants of past groups of people that have worked at the station. You can see what they've been eating, what they were drinking back many decades. I believe this food was from around 1950 or so. Still there, still in the can. Not sure the brisket beef is any good anymore. The lard is probably okay, but we didn't try any of that. When we talk about global change in a completely different type of environment, in this case, this is an image from the Panama Canal Zone in Panama. When discussing tropical deforestation, we need to think about the loss of the species present in this image. There are thousands of species of plants and animals and insects visible in this image. If you were to look closely enough, you would see a whole lot more. Fish, mammals, reptiles, arachnids, millipedes, centipedes, all the creepy crawlers you can imagine in the jungle are here in great abundance. So this is a very biodiverse environment. It's a very healthy ecosystem as long as it's not interfered with. Now here's a shot of the Carretera Americana, or the Pan American Highway, that runs from Alaska to the southern tip of South America in Ushuaia. This Pan American Highway here is in its sort of early state of development. Most people use small motorcycles, horses for transportation. There are buses and trucks that travel through here, but you can see it's a pretty messy affair. It's not a highway as you would perceive a highway in most of North America. Of course, once you get up into northern Canada, the highways start to look a bit more like this, but without the vegetation. So we go from a very diverse ecosystem here to a stripped down, deforested type ecosystem that people develop in order to maintain ownership of the property. You're given land by the Panamanian government if you occupy it and develop it for a number of years. So people will move in and strip out the vegetation and usually raise cattle after selling the timber, and then they move on to planting fruit trees and coffee beans and things like that. We'll get back into that in a minute. Now here we have a map of Central America that displays some locations here. These little spheres represent sample locations where we had taken water samples for isotope analysis. And we'll get back into what isotopes are a little bit later in the course. For our purposes right now, for this lecture, we want to talk about what these isotope numbers or values mean in terms of where moisture comes from, usually starting in the Caribbean and transecting Central America towards the Pacific. Now, some of this water, sometimes a substantial amount, will just roll back into the Caribbean. So it'll strike these mountains and flow downhill right back into the Caribbean. But in some locations, the Panama Canal Zone, the lowlands here in Nicaragua, and a little further up in Guatemala and Mexico, we have pathways where significant moisture can traverse the isthmus and move from the Caribbean side to the Pacific. So what does that have to do with biodiversity? Well, this moisture brings the ability of the rainforest to be a rainforest. When we look at deforestation in Panama, we can see that in this particular image, the trees have been cut down, the valuable timber has been sold, and the land is now essentially ready for rudimentary farming. Generally, this clear cutting is adjacent to the highway, the Carretera Americana, because that's where the road is. That's really the only way to get in and out of this area. Generally, these areas, once they're stripped, slash and burn agriculture, again, get rid of the lumber first, then you move in some cows. Once the cows have done their thing, you can plant fruit trees if you're lucky, establish a coffee plantation if you're even luckier. Most people, small farmers, don't have these options. Now, this is another site. You've seen this image before a few minutes ago. This is a deforested area of Panama. And importantly here, once the rainforest has been stripped away, the moisture is no longer trapped within the rainforest canopy. So it simply evaporates from the soil surface and it moves off to the Pacific, and it's lost. Whereas with the rainforest canopy, that moisture gets recycled over and over again. It evaporates, it drops back to the ground, it transpires, it comes back down as precipitation. It's recycled many times before it moves on. When the vegetation's stripped away, that moisture simply moves off and it's gone out of the picture forever. And that makes it very difficult to reestablish a rainforest once it has been destroyed. So this area has been deforested for cattle. It's likely it's going to remain deforested potentially forever. So again, we started out with a very diverse, healthy ecosystem, and we've converted it into a very low diversity ecosystem that is dominated by cattle and a number of small birds for the most part. So you think about the biodiversity loss in these two environments, it's considerable. Now, getting back quickly to the isotope story, what we observed in looking at the isotope values from Panama, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Guatemala, Belize, Mexico, is that moisture does indeed move from the Caribbean Sea to the Pacific Ocean, again in three primary conduits. So we can see a little bit of that movement here. Again, we'll get back to this later on in the course, but for our purposes now, the influence of this Panamanian and Central American record is that what happens here in Panama, the deforestation in Panama and its change in moisture cycling from the Caribbean side to the Pacific side, doesn't stay here. It's not an isolated problem. It actually affects not only Central America, but also Europe and North America, the rest of North America anyway. So what we can see here in this image is the thermohaline conveyor belt. In this image, it's called the Great Ocean Conveyor Belt. I don't think you'll see that very often. Nonetheless, this is a map of where warm water surface currents are moving along the surface of the ocean, transporting heat, generally to higher latitudes. This water cools off, and in cooling and being salty, it becomes denser, it sinks, and then it migrates around the world's deep ocean basins until it upwells for one or more reasons at particular locations. And we'll get back into that when we talk about ocean circulation. Again, for the time being, what we see here in this movement of moisture along this conveyor belt away from Panama is transport of enormous amounts of heat. As this water gets saltier here in the Caribbean because moisture has moved over Central America and away, it gets warm, and this warm, very salty water works its way up towards Svalbard, the Svalbard archipelago here, north of Iceland, east of Greenland. It gets cold, it sinks, and as that water sinks, it's replaced by more warm water. So this speeds up the conveyor belt when this water is warmer and saltier. That brings warmer weather to these high latitudes, and it also brings a change in precipitation. So what happens down here in Panama doesn't stay in Panama. It actually affects the islands of Ireland, the UK, Svalbard, Iceland, Greenland, maritime Canada, all influenced by what's happening down here in Central America, and potentially by the destruction of the rainforest in this part of the world. Another key question is, what can understanding the Earth's past tell us about the Earth's future? Well, it can tell us quite a bit. This is an image of some feathered dinosaurs. This could be an image from Western Canada 70 million years ago. It looks very much like a bird that lives in Australia today, a cassowary. You might want to Google that, a cassowary. They're fairly large birds, and with these types of claws, they're still pretty dangerous. They do attack and occasionally kill people in Australia to this day. So that's an aside. We do know that environments like this existed. We have plenty of evidence for that. We have the fossils of these animals. We have a general idea of what they're eating and their lifestyle based on their skeletal remains. And we can also do, in rare instances, some isotope work on their bones that'll give us a better definition of what they were eating in their life. So we can tell a lot about the past and use that information to better inform ourselves about what may or may not happen in the future. So in order to make intelligent decisions, whether they're policy decisions or scientific decisions, humanitarian or ecological decisions regarding global changes that may occur in the future, we have to understand how the Earth's climate system works today. So in order to understand the past and the future, it would be very helpful if we got a grip on what's going on in the world today. The climate system is very complicated. It's changed consistently and inconsistently throughout Earth history. To predict how the climate will change in the future, we have to look at the past. And in looking at the past, we're looking at environments where humans weren't capable of influencing the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, or the biosphere in any significant way. So we're looking at pre-human world history or global history. As an example, we're right about the end of an interglacial period. At least we expect the glacial period or interglacial period to end soon. Until about 40 years ago, people were concerned about the return of the ice age proper, or the next glacial period. And with the return of this ice age or glacial period, we would see the end of our warmth on the Earth today. So this was a legitimate fear. Subsequently, in the 80s, increase in our knowledge of El Nino and La Nina events changed that perception, and the better understanding of global warming has changed our perceptions on what we think is going to happen. So we're not so scared of going into the glacial as we are going into a permanent interglacial period in the future, at least the near future. So looking at the past, here we see a couple maps that show some climate records, some of the locations of some of the climate records. There are a whole lot more than this out there available. In the 1950s, scientists noticed that the stable isotope record recovered from deep sea cores showed distinct increases and decreases that appeared to be related to glacial records on land. Now, at the time, in the 50s, we thought there had been 4 glacial episodes. And they have different names depending on whether you're in North America or Europe, but for our purposes, there were believed to be 4 glacial episodes. Cesare Emiliani, a graduate student at the University of Chicago, came along with his study in 1955 that has been enhanced here in this graph below, but it showed something very similar to this. And what Emiliani determined was there weren't 4 glacial periods, there were more like 20. And this was a big deal, a real eye-opener. So people became more concerned than ever in determining what causes these glacial and interglacial fluctuations in the Earth's climate. So it really got its start here in the 1950s in a hardcore scientific way, although people had speculated going back into the mid-1800s about what caused these glacial episodes, and we'll get back to that again later in the course. So initially, these isotope fluctuations observed by Emiliani were thought to represent changing temperature because the oxygen isotope value of a substance, whether it's ice or the calcium carbonate in a shell or in your tooth enamel, is related to temperature. So when temperature goes up or down, the isotope value will change accordingly. But in this case, the mistake was made in that it was really the expansion and contraction of the great ice sheets that were determining the oxygen isotope value of the world's oceans. So it wasn't the temperature of the ocean that was changing dramatically. It was the oxygen isotope value of the ocean that was changing dramatically. And just real quickly, the way that works is there are two main isotopes of oxygen, oxygen 18 and oxygen 16. Oxygen 18 has 2 extra neutrons. It behaves a little bit more sluggish than oxygen 16 in terms of its vibrational frequency and rotational frequency, or rotational speed. This results in a slight physical difference in their behavior. So in basic terms, what happens is oxygen 16 tends to evaporate out of the oceans, form ice, and this ice accumulates on land. That leaves relatively more oxygen 18s behind. So the net result is the oxygen 18 proportion in the ocean goes up when lots of ice is present on land. When that ice melts, all those oxygen 16s go back into the ocean basins, and the oxygen isotope value of the oceans goes down. Okay, so that's the basics. Again, we'll get into this in more detail a little later in the course, but this was the realization subsequent to the original proposal that the isotope variability observed by Emiliani was temperature.